Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. We're here for the launch of the new GI-TOC policy brief, Trafficking of Contagion, Environmental Crime and Biological Threats in the Greater Mekong. It's a newly released brief, which you can download on our website, and our comms team will be sharing links in the chat also to do so. My name is Simone Haysom. I am the Thematic Lead on Environmental Crime at the Global Initiative, and I'm going to be moderating this event. I think everyone will agree that the topic of this policy brief is extremely timely. We're moving out of 2 years of a deep and tragic crisis that is believed to have had zoonotic origins. Many of you will also know that the world is still dealing with other severe diseases, which are believed to have already emerged through the illicit or illegal wildlife trade, such as Ebola, not to mention a range of other biological threats, which our authors will be talking about. For the last 2 years, the policy community has been engaged in processes to beef up the international response and improve pandemic preparedness with a keen eye on wildlife crime drivers. But now we're facing the test. Do we see changes on the ground that show that this harsh lesson is being absorbed? And if not, how do we get there? And when it comes to the complex social, economic, and criminal drivers that feed into zoonotic risk, the Mekong Delta is a zone of prime importance. The Greater Mekong Subregion is home to millions of people, huge biodiversity, and a global epicenter for the illegal trafficking and trading of wildlife, not to mention other illegal commodities. Our speakers today are deeply engaged with these questions of health and security and crime, and bring deep expertise from the region as researchers or practitioners. The first section of this event is going to run as a detailed Q&A with authors and with the experts we have here responding to them. After that, we'll open things up for a general Q&A. You're welcome to also post questions before we get to the Q&A section into the chat or the Q&A, the special Q&A function. And in order to have flow in the midst of the event, I'm going to introduce the full range of our speakers now. So first of all, I'm pleased to introduce the authors of the brief, Dr. Luong and Dr. Nicholas Thomson. Nick is a senior research fellow from the College of the Asia Pacific at Australian National University in Canberra. And Hai is an associate research fellow at the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies at RMIT University in Melbourne, and also a research fellow at the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland. And last but not least, a member of GI-TOC's network of experts. Then our two charming respondents are Valentina Paccieri and Giovanni Brasad from UNODC. Valentina is the regional coordinator of the Law Enforcement and Training Affairs Program, part of the Border Management Program at the UNODC Regional Office for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And Giovanni is the Program Regional Coordinator for the Asia Pacific in the Environment Team at the UNODC Regional Office for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and also a GI expert. To get us started, Nick, I'd like to hand over to you to tell us a bit about your policy brief and the impetus for this research.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simone, and welcome to everyone. And first of all, just to acknowledge, I'm sitting here in Victoria, Australia, on Bunurong country, and so I want to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, but also more generally to First Nations and Indigenous communities around the globe, because a lot of this work actually directly ties in to traditional notions of livelihood and survival, particularly for Indigenous communities. So, I mean, to kind of, take a kind of a step back here, Hai and I came to this work in discussions with GI-TOC a couple of years ago in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Our hypothesis at the time was that as the world kind of rushed to secure and shore up its global health security or pandemic preparedness and response in response to COVID-19, we felt that some of the key drivers of zoonosis infection and some of the key stakeholders who have in a position to influence these kind of situations were just not involved or engaged in what global health security was at that point, and still is often being defined. So just to reiterate, Hai and I have both worked across the Greater Mekong Subregion for a very long time. Hai obviously is a Vietnamese national, and myself as a public health infectious disease person, having spent 20 years living in northern Thailand, but working across the Mekong. So we both had relatively strong links with civil security actors, so police, immigration, customs, etc. And these were the people we really wanted to kind of understand and unpack and engage with a bit more. But the bottom line is here, as Simone has laid out, is that the Mekong is such a biodiverse part of the world. But unfortunately, with that biodiversity, comes opportunities for both the inflow and outflow of wildlife, of animals, of plants, of other invasive species. And part of that is driven by, is facilitated by these kind of porous borders, and borders themselves that have become more porous through legal and socioeconomic drivers, such as north, south, east, west corridor highways, larger infrastructure plays, the designation of special economic zones, where the flow of commodities, whether they be legal or illegal, creates environments where contagion indeed can be trafficked and or indeed kind of transported and moved. On the sideline of that, we also know that some border areas particularly have challenges countering corruption amongst officials. But at the same time, we understand some of these livelihood drivers as well. And I mentioned Indigenous communities before, and the kind of continuum between kind of organised crime and people just kind of survive, in the mix of this kind of informal and formal trade. What COVID-19 has taught us is that biocrimes or environmental crimes have really, really significant biological threats. COVID-19 being the current obvious one. But what we're really being keen to do is kind of highlight the suite of biological threats that relate to biocrimes and environmental crimes more generally. Obviously, zoonoses are the things that we're particularly worried about. So COVID-19, the ongoing pandemics of avian flu, the threat of African swine fever, which is very, very real in Asia. But if we move away from animals and we talk about plants, and we talk about fall armyworm, for example, which come in through both natural pathways and illegal pathways, which can completely take out rice crops, maize crops, sugar crops. We talk about sand mining, which is, the Mekong has been decimated by illegal sand mining, which leads to huge habitat encroachment and implications for biological threats for biodiversity for the native fish, etc. And then we talk about invasive species more generally. So I think what we were saying and what we are seeing is that in pursuit of socioeconomic development, there is a tension between conservation and community livelihood. And as we all know, criminal activities, criminal organisations really thrive in places where there's this kind of contested space, and indeed an informal kind of informal markets and informal mechanisms. So one of the other things that we're really particularly keen to talk about and kind of explore during this and putting together this policy is that the idea of the responses to crimes are very, very different to the responses to infectious disease. So if we take infectious disease on one hand and the global health security community, it tends to be or has to be Ministry of Health led. It's public health, it's vets, and it's all these kind of resources going on to develop, early warning surveillance and epidemiology and to get a much better idea of disease progression and transmission, and et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, we had this other kind of slow burn situation of trying to tackle wildlife trafficking, timber trafficking, and other biocrimes. And so we expect and require nation states to sign up to CITES treaties and a whole range of other international mechanisms to prevent these crimes. We support and engage in capacity building with law enforcement. And this whole idea that if we can get a couple of people to turn up to to a law enforcement training, that will somehow have a huge impact on both enforcement capability, but also environmental crimes more generally. And what we've seen is that it just hasn't. And so, and part of that is because we kind of situate this all within these kind of power dynamics at both a state level and at a porous border level, where power is centralized generally around security actors, whether they be the architecture of the state themselves, or powerful kind of organized crime agencies that have their own kind of security around them themselves. And then very, very distant to that is public health and you know, the field epidemiologist, you know, who might have done a master's of public health in some university somewhere, who's trying to kind of say, hey, hang on a second, I'm at the border, we've got some problems here. And so this obvious kind of dynamic in power imbalance is one of the things that we've been really keen to address. And so what we really want to kind of achieve with this policy brief and in partnership with GI-TOC and UNODC more generally is kind of getting to an understanding that if we want to tackle the crimes, we need to raise the level of awareness that biocrimes have huge implications for biosecurity and therefore have huge implications for national security. So what we would like to see is that as we work towards root and branch approaches to operating protocols for security actors, et cetera, and Giovanni and Valentina can talk to this, is that we would like to see a discourse emerge where we can't win one without winning the other. We can't tackle environmental crimes unless we raise the spectre and the knowledge of civil security actors around the implications of environmental crimes for biological threats. And so herein lies the crux of the policy brief. And we can talk about some of the work that's emerging from this afterwards. But Simone, I think that's probably enough for the moment in terms of some framing remarks. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Nick. That was really interesting. I liked what you said about the continuum between survival and organized crime in these areas, both with contested governance, but also a struggle for livelihoods. I think that it's a line that describes many of the hardest places where we're dealing with wildlife trade threats. So thank you for that. Hi, I'd like to invite you to talk about the research next. One of the big themes that emerges within this problematic is that of areas where there are many communities living, many cross-border communities, and also the need for cross-border law enforcement cooperation. And I wondered if you could frame for our audience what the issues are around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Simone, and hi everyone. My background is criminology, and I start with my research and teaching in the law enforcement institutions across Southeast Asia, particularly in the Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia since 2000s. Very thanks so much my colleague and my partner in this project, Dr. Nicholas Thomson. His sharing is very basic in the half part of the GI funding look for the environment crime and biological threats in the Mekong. It is just half the way we look for around based on the literature review and policy brief. Maybe you can click on in the website GI-TOC. And for myself, I start and look around 10 years ago when the Vietnam Ministry of Public Security in the Vietnam is established in the environment police. It's the first time. It's quite new, and it's as similar as in the Laos and Cambodia. It's a very new one for the environment crime. And we look around the ground and the local community, and particularly the law enforcement agency, including police, ranger, and immigration, border guard, etc. And we recognize a lot of things have to improve and enhance in the knowledge, skill, and also the technical for law enforcement officer, particularly in the frontline officer, to tackling the transnational organized crime, particularly with the environment crime, such as timber trafficking or wildlife trafficking. Nick and I, we meet and discuss with the GI-TOC team, Virginia and Louis, who are also supervisors our project 2 or 3 years ago, before the COVID-19 kicked off. And it's very timely. We asked and we hypothesized the same as my colleague Nick said that. How about the law enforcement recognize and perceive the biological threats impact indirectly or directly on their health when you're tackling with wildlife trafficking? It is a really serious question and also timely for us. From myself, I look for around the cross-border between the Vietnam, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Vietnam, China, 1 decade until now. Look for the law enforcement responsibility and how they collaborate, how they go further cooperation from the local community, not only law enforcement agency, but also with the local community or other stakeholder or donors to improve their skill and their responsibility to combat wildlife trafficking and timber trafficking. Our policy, the brief, it's a very timely and informative and basic information to review how the law enforcement respond their obligation to tackle and to fighting with the wildlife trafficking cross-border in the Mekong region. And now that we nearly finished our second phase to pilot and to conduct it in the ground, sharing border between the Vietnam and 3 neighbor countries, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and China. And hopefully we can just sharing our findings in the next months or in the Singapore event regarding to global health, security and conference. Maybe my colleague Nick will share later on. And our concern, how about the law enforcement can protect by themselves when prevent and combat wildlife trafficking? It is a big issue. Apart from with the wildlife trafficking trend and pattern, a lot of publication already, the same Simone, the kick-off introduction. The question and the key question is about the role of the law enforcement to protect and to help them protect themselves when fighting with the wildlife trafficking. It is a key question. And also we want to improve and we go further this issue as national security. As the initiative our field work, not much country in the Mekong recognize biological threats and environment crime as their national security. That is need further recommendation and look for the further research on the ground. Perhaps I will take over from Simone with the very basic information based on our field to look for collaboration among the law enforcement in Mekong. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Hai. Really interesting comments about the importance of frontline enforcement officers and the very key role that they're playing, both as first responders and also as this interface between the state and between local communities. And also great to hear a bit more about the research that's going to be happening in the future and also the conference in Singapore. And we'll come back at the end to talk about everyone's next steps, but I think it's great to hear that there's going to be further work on this. Valentina, I'd like to invite you to speak to us about your work with the border management program, which is, of course, dealing very directly with frontline officers and their role in responding to this complex area. Valentina, we don't see you or hear you.
Can you hear me?
Now we hear you.
Hello?
Now we hear you
Okay.
and see you. Yeah.
Okay, good. So good afternoon, good evening, everyone from wherever you are connecting. Thank you very much to the Global Initiative for this opportunity. We are very happy to provide some information happening on the ground, what framework can actually be used or are available and are currently being used and have been quite some years now to allow law enforcement
Valentina,
one another.
Your connection is a bit unstable. I don't know if it's possible to connect to a stronger network.
Okay, let me see. Is it better now or is it still unstable?
We can hear you, but maybe your video is frozen. I don't know if it would help to.
Let me move, okay? Just a second.
Okay, sure. Valentina, we could.
Is it better now? Sorry, trying to. Is it better now?
I think so. Yeah, let's try.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So I was saying that we, as UNODC, we have been supporting countries for about 23 years, since 1998. We have been working with countries using what we call the Border Liaison Office framework. And that is basically a framework of law enforcement practitioners, frontline officers that operate at land border posts as mixed entities, so mixed units of different law enforcement agencies, such as immigration officials, such as drug, anti-narcotic officials, environmental police, border guards, that basically are a team of frontline officers with one main role, which is coordinating among one another on investigating transnational organized crime. In the policy brief that was created, it is noted that mainly the BLO network started off as with a focus on anti-narcotics. UNODC and the government in the region have over the years realized the need to make it a more open framework for all type of crime to be actually investigated and to be coordinated through. We are moving forward on that, and that's why there are so many different agencies involved in the network. However, it's undeniable that because of the big role that drugs play in the region, a very big focus is still on drugs. These BLOs BLO offices are located at land border posts, and they basically cover Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. It was also expanded lately in Indonesia. And they are covering 110 locations in the Greater Mekong region and Indonesia. So it's a pretty big network. The focus, as I said, is to coordinate both from between two different countries on TOC, trafficking and investigations, but also internationally. And why could this be important? We said, actually the research said, the briefing said that one of the main goals toward biological threat is actual coordination between different law enforcement and also between countries in the region. And and there is already something that is in place and can be utilized for that. Another thing that we have been doing as UNODC over this pandemic is engaging more with communities. In what way? Both we have carried out an extensive research on the perception of illicit trafficking at borders, actually working and interviewing community members and community leaders. But also we worked closely, not only as UNODC, but also with other UN entities, especially in Laos, to counter and prevent the spread of COVID-19, working both with the Ministry of Health and law enforcement. So there is already a bridge that was established during the pandemic that could be utilized and further strengthened for other intervention. That's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Always good to hear about bridges being built, I have to say. So thank you for telling us about that program work and what sounds like could be a promising set of relationships developing, as well as also that combination of different focuses within the BLOs. I'm going to ask Giovanni to come in. We've been talking about sort of this region where governance is contested and borders are porous, and yet where states are crucial actors. It would be great if you could talk a bit about the work that UNODC has been doing, working with technical capacity of states to respond to these threats, and let us know how that's going.
Thank you, Simone. We've been really working for quite some time now with what for many is still regarded as an emerging crime, the environmental crime, even if the nature of this crime is not emerging at all. It's not new. It's a very old type of crime. But governments, especially here in the Greater Mekong Subregion, have really struggled to bring this type of crime to the top of their security agenda. Valentina already explained quite well how drugs is traditionally the number 1, 2, and 3 priority for law enforcement and for all security institutions here in the region. All other type of crimes come at a much lower level in the priority line within the hierarchies of police authorities, customs, ministries of public security, etc. So for the past 10 to 15 years, we've really tried to raise a little bit the profile of environmental crime by explaining how even issues like wildlife trafficking actually do entail also elements of money laundering, corruption, fraud, violence that generates victims and that qualifies as by the book form of transnational organized crime. So in this sense, we've really tried for many years to increase the security profile of the crimes that affect the environment. What happened with COVID is that now there is a little bit more attention to what are also the health implications of this kind of crimes, this kind of issues. Certainly in other regions of the world, and I'm thinking more of Eastern and Southern Africa, for instance, where the level of poaching of animals like elephants, rhinos, lions, giraffes is to some extent higher than in other regions of the world, or at least in Southeast Asia. There is a little bit more attention and awareness towards the need of protecting natural resources. Here in Southeast Asia, we haven't seen necessarily the same level of poaching activities, Although this is not to say that there is no poaching in Southeast Asia, but we haven't seen the crisis of the past 10-15 years that touched upon some of the magnificent mammals of Africa. We've seen here a crisis that affects animals that are to some extent less known. At least the pangolin was less known until not long ago. And then we've seen that many governments didn't react with the same strength, with the same emphasis that one would have expected. Now, the issue that we see in Southeast Asia is that rather than having this emergency of the poaching, we have an emergency of the breeding facilities, of the market, what we often call the wet markets, or other type of facilities that manage wildlife, but manage wildlife in probably opaque ways. There is a very opaque supply chain. There is some degree of smuggling in some of these facilities. There is a suspicious way of allocating licenses to the private sector that manages these facilities. And these facilities actually do represent now more and more a concern, not only for the illegality of the activities affecting, for instance, illegal wildlife trade, but also for the health implications, because we have to think about these facilities as, in some cases, facilities where animals are malnourished, are sick, develop many forms of sickness, very often are brought either from the wild or from other countries, and then left in miserable conditions, living there, just for the purpose of breeding. And these become also locations where new zoonotic diseases can develop, new pathogens can develop, and that can be passed to humans either through markets, wet markets, or through other forms of interactions, even if it's only for recreational purposes, like going to visit a zoo. So the question that also this report by the Global Initiative raises is whether there is really a link between the implications that even these facilities can have in terms of public health, not only in terms of public security. So this is why, for instance, we have started to develop an interest towards these type of facilities, farms, zoos, wet markets, restaurants that deal with wildlife, to try to understand whether it is possible to reduce the amount of illegalities and therefore the amount of public health risks that they pose. For this, we're working now with FAO, with the United Nations Environment Programme, and other partners, including WHO and the OIE, to actually try to calculate, assess the risks that these facilities pose, and try to engage with the government to understand how to reduce these risks. This is a little example of how, in my opinion, we can try to realign a little bit the security priority with the public health priorities. But otherwise, as the GI report correctly mentions, there's very little alignment at the moment, and the two agendas of the public health sector and the public security sector remain quite separate, at least on the prevention side. We don't see much efforts to prevent the next zoonotic disease or the next pandemic that could be linked to the trade of wildlife.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. That's a really, really interesting comments about the sort of different vectors of threats that you see in Southeast Asia, and that extremely important role of breeding centers. That's very pronounced in the region, and of course a lot of facilities that are not explicitly calling themselves breeding centers but might still be fulfilling that role. And your comments also about drugs being number 1, 2, and 3 priority made me smile. It's definitely something that is such a common problem. There has been so much development of the idea that wildlife crime is serious organized crime, but it can be very difficult to get people to treat it like that, even when rhetorically they sign on. And of course, the threats that we're talking about now were also here before COVID. So there was also zoonotic disease before we had the pandemic. And there's a big question about why it wasn't taken seriously then, and why would it be taken seriously now? Lots for us to come back to in Q&A. I'll have hard questions for everyone. But before we do that, I wanted to pass back to Nick on this question of these conversations that have been happening about how the world sort of absorbs the lesson of the COVID pandemic, and what is the conversation at a high level on the policy front.
Well, yeah, no, thanks so much, and it's always I must say, Simone, it's always fantastic to get the perspectives of colleagues working in different who have different seats at the table. And at the moment, Hai and I have the luxury of kind of academic and academia, which gives you a certain amount of freedom if you can call universities free. But Valentina and Gio and Giovanni working within the UN system, whose governance structure is nation states, and working within the confines of that, and it kind of gives you an idea of what we might think as necessary or possible versus the reality of the real politic of this dynamic. And I just think it's super important. I would say that Giovanni raises a couple of great points. The farms, the breeding farms particularly, so that's kind of been well documented by Counter Traffic World Wildlife Fund, et cetera. So, but if you put it into a more formal sense as well, we have breeding farms for rats, in Vietnam that sit alongside breeding farms for pigs, et cetera, and so what we're getting at here is that there are all types of, farming of wildlife animals and breeding programs that are completely legal, in many senses. Unregulated, yes. Zoonotic potential like explosions, yes. But at the same time, are part of a kind of a formal industry. And that kind of brings me to my other point around one of the things that became really interesting for us was both the formal and the informal trade of livestock. So when you go into kind of projects like this, you think of pangolins, you think of turtles, you think of snakes, you think of bears. You don't think of cows. You don't think of pigs. But what we started to hear and what we started to really kind of explore and grapple with was that the huge movement of agricultural livestock, particularly cattle and particularly pigs, that was done informally. So by informally we mean it's passing through a porous border, it never happened, and then we say formally, informally, whereby it's passing through a legal quarantine situation. The expectation is that livestock will spend 3 weeks in quarantine at a quarantine facility. And then lo and behold, the quarantine people go and check, where are the 4 tons of pork that have come from Laos and gone into Vietnam? Well, where are they? Gone. And they're on a plate somewhere or in a soup bowl or whatever it is. So I think, and what's important about this particular point is it brings into play, in a good way, structures like the OIE, structures like FAO, who are kind of really engaged in livestock and agricultural trade, but not necessarily, having huge backgrounds in the illegal movement of wildlife. I mean, compared to, apropos of what Giovanni said as well. So in some ways, it's a new space for those actors, but in other ways, it's an old space because they've been engaged in developing quarantine capacity and and other things that are really important in terms of, you know, where does your meat come from? Where do your animals come from? So I think that was a really interesting kind of reflection on what Giovanni was saying. The other thing that I kind of want to go to, and this is a bit of a higher order question that we've spoken about before, you know, in terms of a smaller group, the global definition of One Health. And what we see so far, and what has been championed by, particularly by the WHO and multiple bilateral health security programs, is that, you know, we are inherently linked. The health of humans, the health of animals, the health of the planet is inherently linked. So zoonoses outbreaks are as a result of breakdowns in these supply chains, whether they be legal or illegal supply chains. And they result in, exponential kind of developments of zoonoses and all the implications of that. So the thing here, and this is where it really gets kind of interesting, is that we talk about One Health, but we don't talk about all of the actors that are really critically important for a One Health kind of joined up system. And Giovanni and Valentina are working really closely with customs and immigration and quarantine officials and police and militaries as well. But these guys are not really considered part of the One Health definition. So that's okay, right? They don't necessarily need to be part of the definition, but they absolutely have to be part of the operational implementation of responses to it. So, and which gets back to my original point around, unless we're prepared to engage in tackling biocrimes as an absolute consequence of loose borders, of loose or undeveloped knowledge and capacity of key actors around these borders, particularly security actors, we will never prevent the next zoonotic infection. We might prevent, one or two of them, but for every one or two we prevent, there are another 100 getting through. So I think it really, so where we want to go to, and it kind of leads to some more work that we're doing, and in partnership indeed with our colleagues here at GI-TOC and UNODC, is kind of bringing the actors who engage and resource civil security actors, so the people that work with border actors, the donors that work with these institutions, to kind of bring them into a space where they can say, well, hang on a second, we need to be involved in this. We need to be part of this. This is part of our remit. And so the way that we get there, and this is the real, as far as national security and security making goes, the one benefit of COVID is that it has highlighted that health is absolutely fundamentally a construct of national security. So prior to COVID, national security actors would gather around and look at traditional security threats and look at this and look at that. But without health, what we've seen is the world kind of falls apart. So the opportunity for everyone involved in working with civil security actors is this idea that we have to find a way where non-traditional security actors, like health, like animal health, like forestry, like conservation, like fisheries, et cetera, can actively be part of the discussion around national security. And this, and if we can do that, I think that we are really in an exciting place where we can, as a global community, take on some of these global existential threats to our global health security. Thanks, Simone.
Thanks, Nick. Can I unmute? Thanks, Nick. That was a very inspiring speech. Hi, you've got your hand up. Would you like to respond also before I kick things open to the audience to grill our respondents and our speakers?
Yeah, very quickly, Simone. Yeah, catch up with my colleague Nick's sharing, and also combined with Jock Mahajia, if I'm correct, from the Venezuela. Yeah, my background, I said that it's the criminology and policing, and even though I one of the established for the environment anti-environment crime, the faculty in the police academy in Vietnam. We also have the Laos police and Cambodia. We recognize One Health is very separately, frankly, with the law enforcement. Even though that's why our policy brief really timely to recognize, re-highlight it's important to improve knowledge, skill, and technicals for law enforcement frontline, particularly when they is involved to combating transnational wildlife trafficking. It is very important. The same, York, I really agree with you, Dr. Mahari. It's a very poor knowledge and lack of education training for law enforcement agency when recognize the biological threats and zoonotic disease still underbased. That's why we really look for the same need confirm, look for the Mekong for a pilot for the first stage, and maybe expand over the Southeast Asia and so on for regional. It is my effort. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Thanh. We've got a number of open questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to slightly parcel them up between different respondents. But first up, we have a question from Cesar Guedes, and Cesar asks, China is usually a destination market of most of the endangered species and wildlife trafficked in the Mekong Delta. How are Chinese authorities stepping up measures for a more effective prevention of this type of activity and border cooperation? I wonder if, Valentina, would you like to come in? Sure.
Yes, thank you, Simone. Very good question. From our perspective, I can provide you with what we are experiencing at UNODC and how we cooperate on this sector with China. And basically, China is part of the Border Liaison Office network. There are 13 locations, and they are basically located at the border between China, Myanmar, China and Laos, and China, Vietnam. Those BLO locations, the idea is, as I said before, to basically coordinate with the other side of the border on transnational organized crime. And this also includes wildlife trafficking. I myself, just before the pandemic, between January and March 2020, I visited the border between Vietnam and China, but on the Vietnam side, all the BLOs that we have present there, it's 6 BLOs there. And the Chinese authorities were, they had a very good relationship with the Vietnamese ones. We all know that law enforcement is not the same anywhere. We don't have a standard for that. Law enforcement is, although we should have a standard, mostly based on relationships that each individual, each frontline officer has with the other counterpart. So possibly because of also those individuals that are based at the border, that specific cooperation between the two countries was working well. Another thing that another initiative that UNODC is implementing and is working with China is the Mekong Mou that is more related on drug trafficking, but it is still a cooperation mechanism to put in place and to strengthen investigation on drugs as a, let's say, as the main focus, but also other type of crime. I would like to leave the floor. I think Giovanni also has something that can add on this. But because before being the regional coordinator for the wildlife trafficking program, he also was himself a coordinator for the border management program. So he might have, you know, the two sides put together. Thank you, Simone.
Great, thanks, Valentina. Giovanni, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Vale. Thank you, Simone. I can't say much about how China is addressing the issue of wildlife crime domestically, but I've been working with them quite extensively on the transnational form of wildlife crime. And the question, if I read it correctly, is really focused more on the trafficking from outside of China towards China. And I must say that in the past few years, I've seen specifically China Customs and specifically the Anti-Smuggling Bureau of China Customs to really increase quite significantly their efforts to combat wildlife crime, to detect wildlife crime, to confiscate. And given the specific nature of the Anti-Smuggling Bureau, which is not just a customs authority, but it has quite pronounced investigative powers as well, they can actually go all the way to prosecute these some of the wildlife traffickers. So in the past few years, we have seen the Anti-Smuggling Bureau doing quite impressive operations. They've been winning many times the awards given by the UN on the environmental enforcement in Asia. And we've seen them cooperating a lot with Vietnam, but even with countries in Africa, specifically South Africa, there has been a real exchange of intelligence that led to actual arrests and prosecutions. So not only confiscation and seizures, but much beyond that. I don't know whether we can say that this is just scratching the surface, but to me, it's a response that is increasing over time, and it increased also at the time of COVID. When COVID came, the Anti-Smuggling Bureau decided to work harder to make sure that really no wildlife coming from abroad would enter illegally the borders of China. And therefore, they've been on the forefront also of organizing operations among customs authority in Southeast Asia. In Asia, there is an operation called Operation Mekong Dragon that is largely led by China and Vietnam that is actually leading to significant confiscations of wildlife going towards China. So short answer, I think that there has been an increase in response from China.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. I didn't know about the extent of that involvement. The ASB's involvement in the Shuidong network investigation is something that I am aware of, and the Southern East Africa Risk Bulletin of the GI has written up. But I wasn't aware about sort of the full extent of the cooperation. So that's certainly interesting. I wanted to throw out a question, perhaps to Nicholas, as the person with the largest background in epidemiology. But there is a question here about sort of wanting information about the most significant areas of biological threat. And I think, rather than necessarily listing them, does such a resource exist? Is there a risk mapping? Is there a risk matrix or process which people can consult to understand, where the nexus of these problems lies?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, this is a futures exercise in many ways, right? So your public health people and your animal health people will tell you that the next zoonoses are most likely to be a corona type virus. And I think people need to understand in many ways that there are, at any one point in time, as we continue to have closer and closer interactions between our ecosystems and people and animals, indeed, that this thing we call it viral chatter, Simone. So at any one time, if I'm a virus and I'm sitting within a simian or a feline or a reptile, or at any one time, I'm constantly trying to evolve and jump into another host. And so this is happening all the time, it's this idea of viral chatter, like, every second of every day, there's millions of viruses trying to jump but only occasionally do they land, right? So for us, that's very, very lucky. So HIV is a classic example, and obviously COVID, but SARS, and also human-induced human reactive avian flu. So from a zoonotic perspective, there are a whole range of surveillance, like WHO emergency preparedness is looking at zoonosis preparedness. But I think what's actually more important here, Simone, to kind of talk about is how we evolve a early warning system to account for biological threats that are not necessarily obvious in terms of zoonoses, but come from invasive species and plants and animals. And so that is not in place at this point. So they are not joined up. And I think an early warning system that accounts for all these biological threats is where we're going to need to get to. Give me a couple of seconds here. Thank you, Giovanni, for understanding my current situation in the back.
If I can jump to rescue while the kid is screaming. But the question about biological threats is interesting, meaning that a cave full of bats can be regarded as a biological hazard. It becomes a threat only if a human enters that cave. So per se, that cave shouldn't represent a particular threat to humans. But those interactions, as Nicholas was talking about, those interactions between wildlife that is most of the times taken away from its natural habitat and humans within cities, within facilities, markets, that's where we see a threat. So I do see a threat more when there is a forced interaction between wildlife and humans without undergoing the necessary regulations and setting in place good controls and good surveillance and good inspections. Because also one of the main issues that we see is that the current regulations for these kind of facilities are sometimes so poorly written and so poorly thought through that the room for discretion, the room for corruption, both in giving licenses and in inspecting these facilities, really leaves room to any sort of misconduct, both on an illegality point of view, but also from an animal health point of view. So those are the threats that actually we see as more prominent.
Thank you. It's really interesting. I mean, this is really the heart of it, isn't it? So the reason why this policy brief exists is, how do we prevent viral chatter becoming viral screaming or something along those lines? Valentina, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just to add on what Nick and Giovanni said, fresh markets are the heart of anything related to local consumptions. Families just go to fresh markets and get their meat, vegetable, anything that goes on the table is bought at the local market and not at the supermarket, especially in those communities at borders that is very remote. Everything comes from a stall at the market. So this is also where we should look at in the future. It's not only a matter related to law enforcement and Minister of Health, it is a matter also of really engaging with communities. It's not something that can happen overnight. It most likely will need to adapt over a number of years, because fresh markets are within the culture. So how do we change that? How do we make people aware that there are certain risks related to something that is a common practice and that is not necessarily perceived as a threat or as something that can be a hazard on the health? Over.
Yeah, thanks for that, Valentina. Yeah, such a crucial question. I remember a couple of months ago looking at polls that I think it was WWF had done of whether people had consumed wildlife in the previous 12 months, with a quite sharp drop off and sort of frequenting of wet markets immediately after COVID came off, and then a slight tapering of that reluctance. So it's definitely key questions about sustaining behavior change. There's another quite interesting question about management of the threats in the Q&A box. I did want to also throw it out to the other participants. If you want to raise your hand, people can also come on video and ask questions. But please do signal to me if there's something that you would like to ask, or let me know in the main chat. In the Q&A box, we have really a set of questions from Ross, which get down to quite a kind of granular detail about sort of how there should be frontline enforcement of the threat, proposing something that would certainly be controversial, which is the destruction of all material. He's mentioned pangolin scales and elephant ivory, but obviously a lot of the pathogen threat is coming from live animals, and there are big questions there around facilities for animals that are seized in the trade, and also whether laws regulating regular wildlife products can be used more effectively than ones for the illegal, if I understand correctly. I don't know if I've thrown this open to the panel if anyone would like to comment. Particularly, I suppose, Giovanni or Valentina, if you're working with authorities that are dealing with these issues like seized wildlife. I know that it's a major issue for a lot of airports in the region. I don't know what's happening in Greater Mekong.
Maybe I just take a first stab, but probably I think that the very interesting part of the question is that it is actually highlighting the fact that if the trafficking of biological material that can belong to wildlife is actually treated as trafficking of biological hazard, probably the punishments would be much higher than what a wildlife law would carry in terms of penalties. So the whole idea of framing the illegal movement of wildlife across borders as a biological hazard, that's as a biological threat, that would carry much higher, presumably, penalties and seriousness, also in terms of priorities for the law enforcement institutions. So it is indeed an interesting angle, the one of regarding these the trafficking of biological hazards as the primary offense more than an environmental issue. I would tend to agree with that angle.
Okay, thanks very much. Nick, this is obviously something, that the policy brief talks about quite directly, about the value of that reframing, and I wondered if you'd like to come in on that.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's a great question, and it kind of brings so most countries are also signatories to the Biological Weapons Convention. Now, so this is kind of interesting because when we pick up illegal wildlife, whether they be alive or dead, and just to be clear, the threat of biological implications from pangolin scales is way less from the live trafficking of tigers or bats or whatever. Not that it matters, but just in terms of alive or dead. But what we don't know, so if you're a law enforcement official and you're or your Ministry of Defence and your portfolio is the Biological Weapons Convention, you are absolutely entitled within your rights to be questioning what the hell is coming in and out of the borders. And whether it is deliberate or otherwise is at that point unknown. Whether it is a biological threat is at that point unknown. So I think this is a terrific reframing. It's a great question and a great opportunity to reframe. And this is certainly something that we're doing with countries in the Pacific region, I must say, where the ministries of defence are kind of looking at this going, well, hang on a second, we have skin in the game on this because of its potential to be a biological threat, biological weapon threat.
Thanks very much for that. I would quickly throw in a slightly provocative question and ask, is there any risk with this reframing? And hi, you're welcome to come in, where we did see after the COVID outbreak, reports that people had been killing bats. Is there a risk in reframing wild animals as purely threats?
I also agree with Nick. As confirmed, it is a great question. And to be honest, when we started the project, we look for and we want to refine how and what exactly meaning biological threats to impact on in the law enforcement relating to the wildlife trafficking or timber trafficking. It's a little bit blur or a huge and vague definition of the biological threat. That's why at this stage, we're not really ambition to look for chemical or biological and nuclear civilian or the nuclear terrorism in our first stage. We that only look for very baseline understood about the biological relating to zoonotic disease and or the transmission disease from the animal to human beings first, because we want to step by step. That's why Nick and I we want to focus on pilot in some countries in the Mekong region first, to look for how they perceive and how they understood. Very basic. That's why when we design and survey questionnaire and also design the KI, the interview with the participants from range of the law enforcement, with that and we very clearly and very basic definition of the biological threats, excluding. I want to highlight it at this stage. We don't want to look for the nuclear weapon or the nuclear terrorism, because our object to look for and link with the wildlife or timber trafficking. That is just the first stage. It is, I want to share with a very great question from last audience.
Thank you so much for that, Hai. It actually brings me on very nicely to my next question, which is which you've partly answered, but it's this: what are the next steps, both with trafficking of contagion and the report, and Giovanni, very interested to hear how work on this issue will progress over the years.
So, Simone, do you want me to kick in here before things could go pear-shaped through the other existential threat of children?
Please.
I say that in the nicest possible way, because they're obviously not a threat to national security at this point. So listen, we've been in collaboration with GI-TOC and as part of an extension of this work, and also in discussion with UNODC as well. We've engaged in a series of investigations and explorations looking at the baseline knowledge level, capacity, attitudes and behaviours towards biological threat of civil security actors, police, immigration, customs, along 3 border areas of Vietnam. And so the findings from this work will come out ahead of the next kind of real step in this development, which is a meeting on the sidelines of the Global Health Security Conference at the end of June in Singapore. But just to kind of reiterate, so one of the things that we've been saying from a long time ago, whether it was around HIV and police, or indeed avian flu, or indeed COVID, one of the main hooks, and this is where UNODC has been incredibly proactive and useful over a long many years, particularly in the regional office under the leadership of Gio and Valentina and Jeremy. The idea of the role of security sector officials in infectious disease. And so one of the things that we've learned over this time is that self-interest and occupational health and safety are really a key opportunity and driver for us. And so if we drive this idea that if you are a border official, if you're a border official and you're at risk of avian flu or COVID or something else, it is your absolute right to be protected from that and to know how to protect yourself from that. And so one of the real opportunities here is, instead of expecting civil security actors to do everything, what we can expect is that occupational health and safety is part of the job requirement. And so we think that's a softer way into this discussion, Simone, because we're not challenging the behaviours or attitudes towards different biological threats. What we're challenging is, are you prepared for your own health and safety? And so we think that this is something that we can really work with. This is not sensitive. This is basically about people protecting themselves and their families. So just to kind of say that, so that's where we're going in this meeting in June. The other really important thing about this meeting in June is that we will bring some of the donors together who are traditionally funding health security, as well as the donors that are funding security sector reform, together into a room to say, well, hang on a second, the health security money is not getting to the security actors. The security sector money is not addressing biological threats in terms of occupational health and safety. So can we find somewhere in the middle that we can all agree on that ultimately gives us a better joined up process, at the same time understanding, as Giovanni and Valentina in separate conversations, as well as Jeremy at the regional office pointed out, we need to go on a journey with these civil security funds. Okay, so they're caught up in business as usual. We add another business as usual plate to this, which is, biological threats. They're like, well, hang on a second, we're not involved in this. We're just trying to do X, Y, and Z. So we understand the journey, Simone, but this policy brief has been instrumental in kind of bringing this discussion together, and we want to work with everyone who has interest in this, going forward. And the opportunity to meet in Singapore is an excellent next step development.
Thanks, Vic. We have a late entry to the Q&A before I switch to next steps for UNODC, because perhaps they can also speak to this issue, which is, essentially, is there guidance out there for people in these working in areas where there's a strong reliance on bushmeat? I know this is a question that's coming out very strongly in Central and West Africa, so albeit a different region of the world, but where there's this high concern about the biological threats out of the illegal bushmeat trade. And in situations where enforcement is not strong and possibly suffers from issues of corruption. Is there any guidance out there that people can get from international organizations or NGOs? Do we know? Sounds like a job for our brave researchers on this call and elsewhere in GI-TOC.
Listen, there are guidance, like as we know, UNODC and WHO put together COVID guidance for frontline security actors in Laos, and we're looking to expand that work. There's some work being done around policing and pandemics by WHO, but that's not specific guidance around the things that we're talking about. Mark's comment, which I haven't read that particular report, but the idea of prosecution versus occupational health and safety is a great kind of point of interrogation for us. And I would say, and building on what Giovanni and Valentina, everyone has said, World Wildlife Fund and others have done enormous work with policymakers in both Vietnam and China. I mean, the initial reactions that we saw to COVID were extraordinary. I mean, we had the Chinese government, banning the consumption of wildlife products, and we had the same in Vietnam as well. And so, but this is where, as we all know, it gets really interesting. A policy determination versus an operational implementation of that is very, very different. And I think this is where the work between the executive leadership of these agencies versus the subnational provincial kind of levels is really important. And that's why ultimately we're calling here for a kind of a root and branch analysis and engagement with these actors to say, well, hang on a second, these things are frontline expectations that the global community has and frontline expectations that your national security demands. And so therefore, how we can continue to kind of, by using that kind of language, prioritize resourcing into the professional development of these civil security actors, A, gets the crime angle covered off, B, gets the health angle covered off, and C, supports public health and indeed civil society in terms of the respect that we have for our civil security actors, which is a really important determination in as we know, in national security.
Thank you, Nick. Giovanni and Valentina, would you like to next steps?
Okay, I will go first then. Before starting about prosecution, by seeing what's happening on the ground and the level of awareness that frontline officers have on this issue, I would really advise to do something on advocacy, sensitization more than the prosecution framework. We need to work with the law enforcement sector, of course, with the Minister of Health, but also with the private sector as well. We need to engage with the general public, because this is not a law enforcement affair only. So there is the need to take the momentum basically that COVID basically started and build upon that. To make sure that this is something that is envisioned and perceived as a clear issue that needs to be countered in a synergetic way. Over.
And from my side, I just conclude by saying that for us, the next steps are continuing in the implementation of this new project that we just started. It's called Project SAFE, where we are actually trying to assess the risks posed by some of the wildlife facilities that we talked about in this webinar. We will go with the support of the government, together with the government, to conduct fact-finding missions in farms, zoos, restaurants, wet markets, pet shops, and other facilities that deal with wildlife. There, with a questionnaire that tries to map what the main risks are in terms of the management of the facility, the pathogen risks, the type of animals that are inside, what the animal health considerations are, and what are the socioeconomic implications for any decision on what to do with these farms. Should those farms be closed? What's the economic impact in terms of employment and income for the communities that rely on that facility or others. So what we will continue to do over the next few years is to work with FAO and UNEP and other partners, including OIE, to map these risks in Southeast Asia, specifically in Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, and try to assist the governments to develop new regulations without those loopholes, without those gaps that prevent them from mitigating the risks of zoonotic diseases, illegalities, and potentially a new pandemic. So that's what will keep us busy for the next couple of years here in Southeast Asia.
Thanks, important work. Hai, would you like to make a closing comment?
Yes, perhaps in my last act. Yeah, thank Giovanni and Valentina, the representative perhaps from the UN, and particularly we acknowledge the last question from audio. Yeah, Nick and I, we really look for the further researchers or the collaboration, not only the Southeast Asian region, look for the link between the environment, crime, and biological threats. As I mentioned earlier, that is the first step. And we hopefully, the same Giovanni highlights, a lot of work to do in the next few years to go further detail the government across the Mekong region to improve yes, national security recognition link with the environment crime impact, particularly with cross-border. It is not, it's a mathematical or statistical balancing between the public health and law enforcement. But we would like to go further to the protect as One Health program to merge between the law enforcement agencies and public health, particularly in the COVID-19 context. It's a really important thing. That's why it's our next step to conduct it in the three cross sites between Vietnam and their neighbor sharing. We hopefully can still meet again with the audience, with our findings, sharing very basic baseline, how the law enforcement recognize and perceive the biological threats, and then needs to improve their training and technical skill and PEP, etc. It's a very important. And once again, thanks so much for last audience raise a question to spot for researcher look for around in the cross border to explain, identify, and verify what is the biological threat impact on in the law enforcement agency and local communities. Over.
Thanks, Hai. I would like to thank, firstly, the audience. Thank you for staying with us. So many of you for the full 90 minutes. There's clearly a lot of interest in this topic and a lot of interest in guidance and to know what is happening on the ground. I would advise everyone to, of course, read the policy brief and to follow the project as new outputs come out. If you are in Singapore, to attend the events that will be happening at the end of June, is it? Lastly, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to our panelists. It's really been really fascinating to hear about everything you're doing and all the research that has been done. And looking forward to discussions in the future, I'm sure, with all of you.